Hello, my name is Emmy DeGrappa. Each week, we bring you stories asking our guests the question why. We learn about passion, purpose, and the human experience. Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with the generous support of the Wyoming Community Foundation. This is What's Your Why? Today we are talking to Katherine Standefer, author and writer. She is a trauma writing doula, editorial consultant, and writing teacher. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I love that I get to talk to you today. I have been reading your book, Lightning Flowers, which I love, and it's very interesting and complicated, actually, but we'll get to that. But one thing I wanted to ask you is, where did you grow up?
So I grew up in the Chicago suburbs on the northwestern side of Chicago, a little place called Arlington Heights. And it was not a place that I loved. My mom will be sad to hear me say that, but she won't be surprised. My parents started bringing us west when I was very young in a minivan to ski, sort of draped all over the floor of a hotel room. And so I fell in love with the West at a pretty young age. And I first came to Jackson when I was 14 on a family trip. And the next summer ended up doing a backpacking trip down in the Wyoming range for 3 weeks, and then back up here for a few days of kayaking on the Snake and a summit of the Grand Teton. And during that summer, I just really fell in love with what this ecosystem is and what it feels like to be in a place that is still so functional as an ecosystem. You know, my experience growing up in suburban Chicago, even though there are a lot of really good people involved, is just that I had this wild heart, and the land around me was constantly undergoing processes of industrialization. I grew up in an area where now it's pretty much strip malls and big box parking lots and tract homes for hundreds of miles. And it doesn't stop till the Wisconsin border. A lot of the old farmland is gobbled up. A lot of the marshes and bogs and hardwood forests are gone. So I just grew up as a child with this sense of deep ecosystem loss. And I've always wondered if I would have ended up staying in the Midwest, if that place were a little bit more intact, that sometimes what we are attracted to about a place like the West is the fact that there's so much public land. And so we can experience that place differently. But I really had trouble in Chicago. I would see a for sale sign on a lot and just start crying because I understood that all of the trees on that property would be gone.
So that is truly interesting to me, because since you were really young and coming out to the West and camping and hiking, and gosh, you even got to climb the Grand. I haven't even done that yet, but it's because I'm a big chicken. But so it's interesting that you already had an outdoor spirit, let's say. You already had a desire and a love for the outdoors. And who inspired that love? I mean, was it your parents because they brought you out here and you spent some growing up years out in the West?
It was my parents, absolutely. My mom had grown up skiing mostly in Colorado, and so she was really the one who pushed making that a family priority and saving up for those vacations. They only happened every few years when I was really young, and then the older I got and the further in his career my dad got, the more often we got to ski. But I also grew up hiking in Wisconsin. My parents did a summer trip every year with some friends of the family to an area called Devil's Lake that has these old bluffs that were formed by glaciers. Part of what it is that the glacier didn't drift over that area and didn't smash these ancient mountains. And so I hiked a lot as a kid. And when I hit maybe age 10, the local YMCA got one of the first indoor climbing walls. This was when they were kind of a new thing. And so I actually started climbing indoors on Monday nights and went to a climbing camp again in Wisconsin in that same area, same summer that I went to Jackson for the first time. And my dad and I were also in a dad-daughter program together where we started doing these canoe trips And those were really my first experiences. We were on the Wisconsin River, not showering for a few days, having everything you needed with you. So that was something that was kind of slowly getting just folded into me. And it really fit my personality. I was not one of the girls after a certain stage who wanted to like work on her eyebrows or wear a ton of makeup. I really wanted to be a wilder type of being. And so, of course, it's a big jump when you go from Wisconsin to Wyoming in terms of what feels wild and what feels gritty. We had some family trauma unfolding right as I was going into high school. And when I ended up signing up for this backpacking trip, my dad wanted me to do one that was only 14 days. And I basically said, no, like I need to leave for longer. Something in me knew. And so he said, well, you can pay the difference then. And so it just really reoriented my world to then spend my time babysitting, doing lawn care and plant sitting, and eventually getting other jobs. I worked as a cleaning lady, and then I worked selling outdoor gear so that I could send myself on these trips in Wyoming and Alaska and have that longer, deeper experience of just being in the wild. I really recognize that we live our lives in boxes, and to go into the wilderness and then not enter another box for a month, meaning no car, no house, to be literally living outside the box and feel myself changing as the weather worked on me and as encounters with animals worked on me. And as my body became stronger, carrying everything I needed, I just felt more like me. And that has always been kind of the bedrock of my wanting to be here.
Okay, so as a mom, I just have to ask you, did you drive your parents crazy because you were so adventurous and willing? Okay, I'm just going. I don't need a place to live. I'm just going to do whatever I do and make it work.
Absolutely. My parents are pretty conventional people. My mom was an actuarial assistant right out of college. She'd been a math major. My dad went to law school and became a corporate attorney. And then after my mom had the kids and went back to work part-time, she was a preschool teacher. So these were very defined careers. And I don't know that they were psyched that I wanted to be a wilderness instructor. When I graduated college and started instructing skiing for Jackson Hole Mountain Resort, they were joking that they were getting their money's worth on ski school faster than college in terms of like job training and the money in and money out. But I think they also knew that I had a certain kind of spirit, and that my mom is the one who took us west. She understood something about why you might fall in love with certain places. And I think she understood that I didn't really fit in the place that I was born. It was very hard for me socially, very hard for me in terms of the activities that were available for me, and just needing a different kind of open space for my soul. So, the summer I first came to Jackson was my first backpacking trip. And then the next summer, I did a course with the same organization. They're, by the way, known as Trails Wilderness School, and they were based on the old Teton Valley Ranch in Kelly. And they have since folded. But this trip in Alaska, my parents had to send me off. And it was right when all those scary, like ice climbing, alpinism type movies were coming out. And they made the mistake of watching one while I was in the backcountry. And they just had all these nightmares about crevasses and glaciers calving. I was fine.
And sliding to your death. Yeah.
Yeah. I did actually punch through into a crevasse at one point in Alaska, but I was lucky. The crevasse was full of water and my backpack sort of caught on the ice. So I went from walking across this glacier to all of a sudden I was up to my waist, bobbing in water with my backpack kind of holding me on this thin ice. And that was what glacier travel was. We were roped up for exactly that reason. So the team was able to extract me. But my mom was kind of like, no one else has their 16-year-old like falling in crevasses, worrying about rock falls and avalanches. Like, why do you have to do this?
I know. She's probably thinking, where did we go wrong?
No boyfriend, no prom, just glaciers.
Oh my God, that's so funny. What is your degree in? And where'd you graduate from school?
So I ended up going to the Colorado College, which is in Colorado Springs. It's a tiny liberal arts school. And it was an absolute dream for me because you take one class at a time for 3.5 weeks. It's on the block plan. And so what that enabled was a very experiential form of education. I ended up being an English major with a specialization in creative writing, and I was on the fiction track. And then my second major was sociology. If you leap forward into the future, fiction plus sociology is basically creative nonfiction or journalism. And I, of course, just published my first book in narrative nonfiction. So that really makes sense. But it was an extraordinary experience to get to go to school there.
I want to talk about your book now. Your new book, Lightning Flowers, My Journey to Uncover the Cost of Saving a Life. And it's an intense book. And I'm so glad you sent it to me to read ahead because, well, first of all, I was starting to think I should be a doctor to read this book because there's so many acronyms in it, and just understanding what you were going through and trying to, figure out, well, what does that mean? And then understanding what it did mean. So just a synopsis, tell us about your book, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so Lightning Flowers is the story of my troubled relationship to my own cardiac defibrillator and my experience living with a genetic heart condition within the context of the American healthcare system. The easiest way to talk about the events in the book is that when I was 24 years old, I was working as a ski instructor and a climbing guide here in town, and I randomly went into cardiac arrest in a parking lot while uninsured in a pre-Obamacare US. And so it's really a book about what happens when a young person who has kind of a stereotypical orientation toward feeling invincible has to face death, and how does that impact their relationships, and what does it take in the US to get the care that you need, both pre-Obamacare and post-Obamacare? What do those systems actually look like as we move through them? In my story, when I passed out uninsured, age 24, I ended up having to quit my life here in Jackson and move to Boulder, Colorado. My younger sister had the same condition, and her surgeon said he would help me, that he would donate his surgical fee, but he could only do it if I were local. And Colorado had better social services at the time than Wyoming. I used to joke all the time that in Wyoming, if your car breaks down, you'll have multiple people fighting to help you. People are so warm, and they're so empathetic and helpful and useful. And also, there is a real individualist streak in Wyoming, and we didn't have systems on a statewide basis that I could turn to at that moment in my own healthcare. And so I had to leave. And so I went to Colorado, and the book tells the story of having my first heart surgery, and 6 months later, going septic, almost dying of sepsis, having a breakup kind of as a result of all of the strain that my relationship went through during that crisis. And later on in the book, that story transforms a little bit because I do have insurance through the Affordable Care Act, and yet it's a really complex thing to get the care I need in the way I need it, the way the systems are set up. And so I hope that the book helps people think through, what does it actually mean when we ask for access to healthcare? What does it actually mean to get care and to feel cared for? And what does it cost us, both financially and actually in terms of the health of our bodies, when we have to actually wrestle a system in order to get care in certain circumstances? But the book is also much, much broader than this, in that one of the things I got very interested in really when I was in grad school in 2012, 2013, I had this crazy thing happen to me that is what kicks off the book. My cardiac defibrillator that I had implanted in Boulder in 2009, it started shocking me unexpectedly. And that happened because of an error in my settings. Like, okay, cyborg problems. And I took 2000 volts to the heart while I was on this soccer field at an intramural grad school game. And in the moments afterward, I found myself smelling my own burned tissues and really thinking about this piece of metal that was inside me that had been billed for me as something that could save my life. And cardiac defibrillators do save many lives. My younger sister's life has been saved by hers. But in my case, I was beginning to wonder, what if this thing causes more problems than saving my life? And also, where did this metal in my body come from? And is it possible it came from a scenario like conflict minerals or some other human rights or ecosystem issue where my life is saved, but other lives are negatively impacted? And that's kind of an impossible question to ask within a global supply chain where we're not very good at tracing things. A lot of companies at that time, especially, didn't really know what was in their products, where the raw ingredients were coming from. And so I went on a global journey to try to understand what it means to have this metal box with microelectronics in my body. And so Lightning Flowers is not just a reckoning with the defibrillator sort of in my personal story in terms of healthcare and relationships and my body, but it's also the story of the cardiac defibrillator and its roots. And this question of what does it mean to save a life? What does it cost elsewhere? What does it cost me? And when is my life saved? What do we do when medical technology or healthcare systems have negative impacts on lives?
Just to go back a little bit, because this was really interesting to me. So this is a genetic condition.
It is a genetic condition. It's called long QT syndrome. And if you think about the heart, it is an electric organ. There's something called the sinus node, which is known as the heart's pacemaker. And the sinus node generates signals that tell other parts of the heart's tissue when it's time to beat. And so each time the heart beats, there's actually a period of repolarization where the heart prepares to beat. And then the sinus node sends a signal and all the different parts of the heart beat. And theoretically, they're synchronized enough that the heart pumps oxygenated blood out to all the different parts of the body that need it. With long QT syndrome, we can have a problem in the repolarization interval of the heart. It has to do with the potassium ion channel. This is like very geeky electric genetic stuff. I see electrophysiologists, meaning the plumbing of my heart is fine. It's the electrical system. And basically, with type 2 of long QT syndrome, we can see the repolarization interval of the heart getting kind of elongated, meaning when the heart is supposed to beat, certain parts of it are ready and some parts of it aren't ready. It's not synchronized. We end up with kind of a quivering action instead of actual pumping. And so that's when someone might pass out or actually be in cardiac arrest. And it's a funny syndrome. It's viewed as relatively rare, but it's very hard to get a hold on the actual rates of it because it looks like other things. Meaning, when you see athletes dying suddenly on the field as teenagers, sometimes this is long QT syndrome, or it can be sudden infant death syndrome. It can be unexplained car crashes or drownings, because what's happening is people are suddenly going unconscious. And then whatever unfolds next, unfolds next. If you don't have oxygenated blood, you die. Both my sister and I were very lucky in that our hearts restarted themselves. Christine started going into cardiac arrest in her dorm room at age 18. I just this morning actually found out about a cousin of mine. I'm not sure why she hasn't been tested yet, but the word is that she just had seizures. It's like, well, did she have seizures? Or does she have long QT syndrome? So part of diagnosing this depends on how well we know to ask the question, and are the medical professionals involved paying attention to this as a possibility? Long QT advocacy groups are working a lot with getting AEDs posted by ball fields and in school hallways. Obviously, they're already in airports. And it's because when something like this takes someone down, sometimes that's the only chance for them to survive beyond just a lot of CPR.
So is long QT syndrome a lot more common than people think or know about?
It's possible. It's possible.
I mean,
I think the last statistic I saw was about 1 in 2,000, but it's hard to know. And part of it is that this is what we've been learning about genetics in the last 20 years. It's not just what gene you have, but what other genes you have, and what genes are sort of being turned on and off by the circumstances of your life and by maybe even the generation before you. What they lived through can kind of turn genes on and turn genes off. So my sister and I both have the gene, but how it has showed up in our lives is extremely different. Hers is much more aggressive than mine. Yeah. that just makes it kind of mysterious. Androgen also can be a protective factor. So like my dad, once we did genetic testing, they were able to diagnose him with long QT. He is the one that passed it on. But had he ever had a symptom? Had a doctor ever noticed it on his EKG? No. And so, yeah, just because you have it doesn't mean it will be dangerous. But if you don't know you have it and it is dangerous, it's extremely dangerous.
I guess since your sister had it first, it wasn't a total surprise to you then.
It wasn't. When I woke up in the parking lot, I knew. Well, when I woke up in the parking lot, I didn't know who I was or where I was for a certain amount of time. And then slowly, as my faculties came back and I was able to speak and to move, I knew what it was and I knew exactly what was about to happen to my life. You know, when my younger sister did get diagnosed, my parents had wanted me to walk into St. John's Hospital and have an EKG done. And it was like, I'm uninsured. And they were like, well, we'll pay for it. And it was like, what 23-year-old on her day off just like goes into the hospital to ask for an EKG? I mean, I just had barely been to doctors at all at that point. I was so privileged in terms of how my body had functioned throughout my life. And I also didn't really understand the healthcare system. Because I came from a background of privilege, I had never seen people around me not have health insurance. And I'd never seen what happens when you don't have health insurance and you enter a health crisis. And so it was just sort of like an impossibility to me. On the other hand, I think I knew that if I did have it, a certain version of my life was going to be over. You know, I had been working in outdoor education and adventure sports for several years. Since I took the courses at Trails Wilderness School, I did their leadership course. I worked for them for a couple summers. I worked for other organizations here in town after that. And part of why I liked it was I always knew I was going to be a writer. And at normal jobs, I was not going to have the kind of time and attention I needed to write. And with these outdoor jobs, you could work a bunch all at once, get a big paycheck, and then spend the mud season writing. And so I understood immediately that if I needed a job that had health benefits, I was going to lose my writing life in the way that I knew it. And so there was a lot of kind of willful denial because I could not picture giving up these outdoor jobs and facing the fact that I would need to figure out insurance, which back then meant find a job that has insurance.
On one hand, it's almost like you were still choosing a life path, even though, I mean, you didn't have insurance, but you were making those decisions. Like, if I make this decision, my life goes this way. And if I make this decision, my life goes that way. So even though you were having this trauma in your life with the QT syndrome and what had to happen to you, and even though you didn't have insurance, just kind of, I feel like in the back of your mind and in your heart, you're like, I don't want to give up what I want, even if I have this condition.
The idea that getting diagnosed with a heart condition, especially one that has nothing to do with decisions that you've made, right? This is not a degenerative condition that is the result of, I don't know, eating burgers 6 times a week late in life, right? We all understand, like, we make choices and our bodies wear out in certain ways or accrue particular types of damage. If you ski a lot, you might have trouble with your knees. I mean, all of this makes sense. This was not that type of condition. This was so random. You know, I was one of the healthiest people I knew. I ran up mountains. I ate organic food. I was breathing this fresh Wyoming air and drinking from the top of the river. and yet here it was. And it was like, wow, getting diagnosed with this heart condition is going to both take me away from Wyoming, this thing I love most, and writing, the thing I love most. Mm-hmm. And it was, I think, a lot of what I try to write about in Lightning Flowers is the difference between the experience of a health condition and its impacts, mm-hmm. and the experience of a system that doesn't function. Because it was not inevitable that getting diagnosed with a heart condition would mean I would need to quit my life, move to a different state, give up this thing I love, take a different job. That's a very American story. That's the result of the systems we live in. That did not have to happen. And my younger sister having this condition, she was a college student. She was still on my dad's insurance. And you know what happened to her? She had the cardiac defibrillator placed, but she was still surrounded by the people she loved. She didn't have to stop going to school or something. There was something that functioned in where she was placed in the system that didn't function from where I was placed. And, it's very interesting to see now that I have made my way back to being a writer. I did get to write and publish a book, but I really wonder if all of that would have happened or how it would have happened without the Affordable Care Act, which, it should be clear from the way I talk about it, I don't view as a perfect law, but it did enable me to be an independent writer and still access health insurance as someone with a heart condition.
I'm interested in that operation that they do on your heart and put in the defibrillator.
Say that 10 times fast.
What are the risks and how long does it take to recover?
So a defibrillator implantation, with the way they usually do it, it's actually technically an outpatient procedure, which should not be lumped in with like super easy recovery, especially for the first one. But basically what they do, and folks who are maybe queasy, fast forward a minute or something, they make a little incision, usually above the left breast, and they have to carve a pocket for the cardiac defibrillator out of your pectoral. They basically have to make room. There's not naturally room in the body to just stick a big titanium chunk in there. And so they have to kind of make some room for it. And then what they do is they thread the wire down your vein and screw it into your heart. So defibrillator wires have a little corkscrew on the end, usually with a steroid inside it, so that when you screw it in, the tissue growth is encouraged. Because if you think about this as an engineering problem, hearts are beating all the time. If you have a low heart rate, it's beating 60 times a minute. And many of us are exercising and having far more beats than that. And so that is constant movement. If you think about like unwinding a paper clip and moving it back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, how long can you do that before it snaps? So people who engineered defibrillator wires had to think about, how do we put a wire in the heart that's going to be moving all the time that doesn't become immediately degraded? And so they thread it down the vein. They have the little corkscrew on the end. The steroid helps tissue grow to hold it in the exact right spot so that it can sense the heartbeat correctly, because you don't want it to be sensing incorrectly and then send unnecessary electricity to the heart. That's what happened to my younger sister after her first surgery. So she had to have a second surgery. They had to pull everything out and do it again. And so then you live with usually two wires, one in the ventricle and one in the atrium, that go up your vein to this box, and they sew up the incision. And theoretically, in the future, if your wire can last, you can replace that box and plug in the old wire to a new defibrillator. The battery used to last kind of 4 to 8 years. Now we're up to 4 to 10 years. That low end remains the same because it all depends on how much electricity you're using. And so if folks really have a heart problem where their device needs to do a lot of pacing of their heart or send big shocks often, they're just going to run out of battery a little faster. Mine tend to last the whole time because my heart condition is not very active now. And so then you asked about the recovery. Part of what you're recovering from is having a wire corkscrewed into your heart, which I didn't understand when it happened to me. This is the stuff about writing a book where you're like, okay, did I really want to know that? Do I really want to make other people with ICDs read that? But it's also fascinating and very validating, because sometimes the medical language that you get when you're just doing, quote unquote, just doing a cath lab procedure, they'll really minimize, like, this isn't a big deal, this will be an easy recovery. And it's just not true for so many of us. And so you're recovering from the corkscrew into your heart tissue. Also, when they finish the implantation, they trigger a shock. They basically trigger an arrhythmia, and they wait to see if your device will correct it because they want to make sure everything's working correctly. So you have just been shocked while you were under. And I can tell you from being awake during shocks, that hurts. You will feel that afterward in your tissues. And then you're recovering from having this box pressed into your pectoral and having that incision need to close around it. And that's really the hardest part, because if you move your left arm too much up or out, or you hold too much, you can actually, jostle that wire and affect how it is placed in the heart. So you have to really keep one arm in close to your body as the muscles get used to all of that. It's very painful. It's about, I think the recovery time, I think they've amended what they say. So I shouldn't offer a specific estimate. But when I had my first heart surgery, they had told me that the wire could still move up to 6 months out. Kind of after the 6-month mark, you were safer. So for that time, I was, very slowly working back in terms of being able to do more walking, then being able to do more running, even being able to wash the cast iron skillet. My partner was not happy. My partner at the time was not happy to have a girlfriend who could not help with the dishes at all. I actually couldn't dress myself because that requires moving your arm up. So you really need someone to be able to sort of thread your sleeve over you. So it is quite extensive that first time as the body is making room for the device. The recoveries after that can be a little less, but also a body under anesthesia it's always something, and you can't ever quite predict how you're going to feel.
I guess my other question is how long does this little machine in your heart last? How long does the defibrillator last? Or do you have to go back in? Do you have to constantly be checking on it? What's your upkeep on that little piece of machine?
So that's where it matters how much battery you're using. And 4 to 10 years is the current estimate on most of them. Yeah. And I've had my current one in since 2016, and I have 3 years of battery life left. So that's about on target.
Okay. So then after that, after your whole life changed and you had heart surgery, what was your real, desire to learn where it was made and what the metals were used, and your trips, where else did you go besides Africa?
That was the main site for my research.
Okay.
Yeah. So I went to a brand new cobalt and nickel mine being carved out of the Madagascar jungle. And then I went to a titanium sands mine in the southeast of Madagascar. I visited a very old gold mine in South Africa that is now underneath a amusement park. It's funny because when you do these types of research missions as a writer, you never know what you're going to use. There's actually a whole trip I did to the Congo that's not in the book because it just wasn't the right kind of material. But there is a section in the book from Rwanda where I visited a tantalum mine kind of on the edge of the country near Congo. So yeah, I've always, as I spoke earlier, I've always been a certain type of person, from mourning trees in Illinois as a girl to I used to make my mom stay in the car if that Phil Collins song, Another Day in Paradise, was playing. It's basically a song where he's having empathy for people who are unhoused, who are really struggling. And I would just sit in the car and cry, and we weren't allowed to leave the car. So there's a certain connection that I have to the suffering of others and questions of social problems and how systems that we build collectively create and maintain social problems. That's something that I'm really interested in. That's the sociology side of my brain. And so at the time that I passed out, I was already very familiar with the work of Eve Ensler. She's a playwright who put out the Vagina Monologues. That's sort of her most famous work. But she also was involved in sex assault, really recovery in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In the year 2012, when I took those shocks to the heart, Congo was known as the rape capital of the world. And basically what was happening is that the electronics boom, the personal electronics boom in the US, so your laptops, the rise of iPhones, all of this was fueling the first wave of really needing to dig up certain minerals at high volume that could earn people a lot of money. So a lot of the minerals needed for these electronics are found in Congo, which has been called a geological scandal. I love that term for Congo. And so basically there were a lot of armed groups in the area. It's a little long-winded for me to go into why, but it relates to the Rwandan genocide in 1994 and some of the ongoing political dynamics of that area. But basically there were a lot of armed groups in Congo that were able to seize these mines. They were hand-dug pit mines, meaning no industrial equipment, no big corporations involved. In some places where corporations could have been involved, the armed groups would sort of run them out of there. And so what we had was armed groups getting a lot of money based on the electronics boom in the US, and all these NGOs really starting to call for a little bit of accountability in terms of how that electronics money was enabling armed groups to rain terror over local communities. There were a lot of sort of rape and pillage situations, sex slavery, forced child labor. The term for this is conflict minerals. And I was just very aware of it because of being looped into certain geopolitical conversations and loving Eve Ensler's work. And so I think that was kind of primed in me when I was lying there and smelling my own burned tissues and wondering if my life had been saved. Because when you've waited, at that point, I had had the device for about 3 years and it had been quiet inside me. And so I'd started to trust that it just wasn't going to go off. So then when it went off, it was like, well, did I almost die? Did it save my life? And if it saved my life, where did it come from? And what is my relationship to these other communities or ecosystems that enabled this to be in my body? And it was an interesting process that I walked because I sort of started with this worst case scenario. I first went to the defibrillator company, St. Jude Medical, which is the maker of the device in my body. I went to their factory first in Scottsdale, Arizona, and then in Sylmar, California, which is LA area. And talking to them, it just became really clear that we would never be able to find out what the exact device in my body had in it. But beyond that, I started thinking like, okay, this is one worst case scenario. What are the other scenarios? How much do I know about mining? And where are certain minerals coming from around the globe? And what's the diversity of situations that they're coming from? And how true is it that mines are, quote unquote, more environmentally sound in more Western countries versus not? What are the environmental regulations that are unfolding? And so I got very interested in this cobalt and nickel mine in Madagascar because it had been winning all these awards for sustainability, for social projects. And so I really went to Madagascar thinking, I know the worst case scenario. What does the best case scenario look like? And how is my life connected to those people? And as you might imagine, it was much more complex than I think I ever could have imagined, but really enabled me to wrap my brain around extraction as a fundamental human activity, right? That everyone you meet in every village, in any type of country, people are building homes out of trees, out of reeds. When someone gets sick in their family or when someone needs school fees, they'll dig a little gold out of the river. And yet the way that we mine industrially is so different than how things have been done throughout human history. And so it really enabled me to wrap my brain around how I could feel if certain things were true about the metals in my body versus other things. And ultimately, what it really led me to was this understanding just of how precious one defibrillator is. And that may sound really obvious when you think about a life-saving device, but it's actually not how we treat it within our medical system. We often put devices in people prophylactically when they don't necessarily need them. And some of those dynamics are driven by ideas about profit or worries over torts being sued. And also we have this sense that the most technological solution is the best solution. We really get geeky about that. We love tech. And what I learned, not to spoil the book for readers, but my defibrillator wire ended up snapping off inside my body. And they have a stripped nest of wire stuck in my right ventricle. And so for me, my larger concerns now are not only about the healthcare system, but about the dark side of the technology. Really, no one prepared me for. The device has never saved my life. And actually, I may end up removing the device. A complicated set of decisions with my doctors, but my long QT can be controlled through medications in a very low maintenance way. And when I think about what it takes to make a defibrillator and sort of what my relationship to death is now, that type of resource use no longer feels in alignment for me at this time. And I'm very interested in how our industries can treat defibrillators as devices to potentially even reuse, because they take so much to make. And we really need to honor the gift that we're given in those resources.
I could have a whole nother podcast with you on medicine and doctors and how they automatically will just put someone on a medication or, make people addicted to antidepressants, or I could just go on and on. But all of it. And so many don't go outside of their own box, like you were talking about boxes earlier. And find alternative ways for people to heal and live without a pill, for example, But in your case, instead of having the defibrillator, I'm never going to say this word. I'm going to practice it. Okay, I'll practice it, Katie.
The ICD.
Defibrillator. Oh my gosh. Anyway, what is a trauma writing doula?
Yeah, first of all, it's a term I made up.
Oh, okay.
This is not
like really, a thing. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I may need to slap a trademark on it. Better. Yeah. So a trauma writing doula, when I'm doing that work, I am helping nonfiction writers birth extremely difficult stories. And both the process of writing Lightning Flowers and the process of teaching other types of writing classes, namely about illness and sexuality, they really tutored me in the fact that you can't engage some of these topics on the page without confronting the reality of what trauma is in the body. So in order to write about trauma, especially through a lens of nonfiction, where we are not just dabbling and creating a character who's sort of like us, we're really trying to move our own experiences fully onto the page, we encounter these physiological hurdles. Trauma is not the event itself, it's the nervous system's adaptation to what happened. And so often people who are trying to write through trauma, they have memories stored in different parts of their body. They're having a lot of strange pain. Maybe they're blocked in certain ways that is essentially their system trying to protect them, because we can't live a normal life. We can't show up to our 9 to 5 when we are in acute trauma reactions. What's essentially happening is that the sympathetic nervous system is coming on. That's our fight or flight system. It is our reptilian brain. It's the oldest part of our brain. And when the blood is going to that part of the brain, the blood is not going to the neocortex, which is the most human part of our brain, and which is where we create from. It's where creativity and philosophy and intellectualism all come in. If you're going into a car crash, you're not philosophizing. You are thinking about what you need to do next to survive the situation. And so that's a great thing about human bodies. But when we end up in survival-based situations over and over again, that part of our system gets very strong. The neural pathways get very deep. And it means that to try to write about that stuff can really trigger these extremely uncomfortable, unbearable reactions that get in the way of living our lives. And again, because it turns on our reptilian brain, it can actually keep us from writing about it because we can't get that creative part of us on. So yeah, what I do with trauma writers, it's partially born of study at the Arizona Trauma Institute. It's partially born of the time that I worked as a sex educator, which has spanned back since 2010. And it's also coming out of my own work with healers and my work to birth Lightning Flowers, which has a lot of extreme medical trauma as a part of it. I really came to understand how to work with people through those physiological hurdles, as well as through the social barriers to their storytelling, meaning what stories were they given growing up about what it's okay to say and not say? What are we allowed to share about our illness? What makes us too much or self-indulgent? How are we allowed to talk about our bodies? How are we allowed to talk about systems? So we work through the social barriers around that trauma storytelling. And then the craft challenges. So if you have fragmented memories or dissociation, it's very hard to tell a story from A to B. You may not have all the pieces. How do you work with that fragmentation? How do you work with stories that may not have a resolution because you are still in them and always in them, even as some parts of your life change? So we work with different structures, really the tools of writing and how they can best tell stories of trauma. And then the last piece is the spiritual invitations of writing about trauma. And this is something that I came to after a few years doing the work and really doing my own work as well. If you're going to sit down and confront certain stories on the page, it's going to change you. If you're really doing that physiological work of showing up to trauma processing somatically, and if you're really challenging the messages that you got around stories of sex assault or stories of illness or what it meant to be violated by someone in a certain way, even living through a natural disaster, as you wrestle with those things, as you reckon, as you put it on the page beautifully, it requires you to face yourself, to face certain truths, to have conversations with certain family members. And that is scary. That can actually make you a different person. And so in trauma writing doula work, it's differentiated from coaching in that I'm not interested in your word count, hitting the deadlines. What we're doing is really interacting in an underworld process of moving these powerful stories that the culture needs. They have such medicine, but they're really difficult and you shouldn't have to do it alone.
That was excellent. For a lot of people, and I've read, and I know this for myself, actually, journaling is very important. Just writing down your thoughts on a daily basis. And that helps you get feelings out, or a lot of what we feel is how we see ourselves in the world. So we suppress many things. We don't think it's right, or maybe it is okay, or maybe you're too worried about what other people think about you. So I think people do practice a lot of suppression in their lives on a daily basis. And when you're out in the work world, you experience those interactions with people all the time, because some people you flow with, some people you don't have that kind of energy with, and you just kind of don't flow with, and you're always got, have your guard up. And I always wondered about that, because some people I meet and I instantly like them and enjoy them. And other people I meet and I instantly, like, whatever it is in our energy and our spirit, it doesn't feel good.
Yeah, I think the trauma brain especially, and by that I mean sort of early life nervous system adaptations, it's so subtle that sometimes we're picking up energies we don't even realize we're picking up. Maybe there's someone in our office that makes us feel really just defensive all the time. And what's really happening is that the way that they interact with everyone else brings up this subtle power dynamic that reminds us of something deeply from childhood. Humans are communal species. And I talk a lot in my work with people about shame, because Brené Brown defines shame as the intensely painful fear of being unlovable, which I just think is so brilliant. And that means that when we are writing, we have an intense fear of doing things, saying things that will make us seem wrong, bad, according to these patterns that we intersected with when we were really young. We all are picking up messages from other people about how it's okay to be. And we're learning from negative interactions from our earliest ages. And so that person in the office who makes us defensive, maybe they're playing out a very similar power dynamic to something that made us feel really unsafe when we were little. And we can't quite do that math consciously, because it's not like something we remember. It's just something that prickles. And so there's a lot about trauma and trauma writing that's very gaslighty. It's very subtle. And you can think that all of it is just your problem. But actually, in order to be able to move the writing out into the world, there's a lot of validity to whatever you're experiencing and ways to move through it that ultimately improve the storytelling.
Oh my gosh, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, I like that you say that it's not a conscious thing, it's subconscious. it's something there that we have never recognized, and how you're working with people to maybe bring it to the surface so they can tell their story. That's really important work, but it must be, as I'm thinking about it, that's exhausting. That is exhausting, Kate.
It is really exhausting.
I'm just
Yeah.
exhausted, like thinking about working with someone. You must just go home and just look at the ceiling and go, oh my gosh.
I did text a friend this morning. I was sitting at Pearl Street Bagels reading an essay for someone, and it is unfortunately about an experience of being raped as a child repeatedly over 2 years by a neighbor. And I had just had this moment of like, this isn't normal for other people. Like, I have a lot of clients who were abused in that type of way when they were kids. And so it is very much a part of my flow that this is material I help them hold. And I think when I say it in that way, it really makes clear to people why a trauma writing doula is necessary. Because if you're trying to write about those experiences and you're just going to like bring that essay to whatever writers group in town, and how many teachers are going to respond well to that, they may be overwhelmed. Their nervous system may not be able to take it. Maybe they have similar experiences, but they haven't done work around it. So they're just triggered. So for me, part of it is naturally how I'm built, that I just have a nervous system that can hold a lot of darkness and it doesn't negatively impact me. But part of it then is my own trauma work and having studied how to do this stuff and really combining the section of the work that is being with people, being able to hold it with them, and then also bringing my brain online and saying, okay, the story is working in this way and not this way, and let's tweak this scene, and what is the idea you're trying to work with, and kind of being able to work on all those levels. And so once I started to do it, I understood, wow, there's a lot of work that we do actually need in the world, and people need to do this writing, but it's not going to be a fit for a lot of the writing community or coaches that people might initially reach out to.
No, I think it's excellent. I think it's a good work that you're doing. Well, I could talk to you all day, but I have to end our conversation. It's been so great talking to you, Katie. And I'm gonna put all the links, but I want you to tell our audience right now all the ways that they can find out about Lightning Flowers and ways to find out about you and the work you do.
Fabulous. Thank you. Lightning Flowers should be available at any bookstore. It is through a major publisher. So if it's not in stock at the bookstore, they can certainly order it. It's also available online through any major book retailer. My website is katherinestandefer.com. You can find interviews on the New York Times and NPR's Fresh Air. There's a lot available about the book online if you're curious. My Instagram and Twitter handles are @girlmakesfire. And one thing that's really important to me, in addition to my teaching, which you can find out about on my website, I have a ton of classes coming up online and in person in a couple places in Colorado and Michigan. But one thing that's really important to me is that I have a patron network through Patreon. There are 61 people who support me monthly to make sure that my writing gets done and not just the teaching side. And so if you do fall in love with my work, I would love to have you on my Patreon. And I write them special letters and updates about the writing life.
Excellent. What an honor it has been to talk to you, because you have such a wealth of information. You've just had life-changing things, and you're just sharing that with the world, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was very special.
All right. Thanks, Katie. Take care.
Bye, Emmy.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of What's Your Why? Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with support from Wyoming Community Foundation and generous supporters like you. To learn more, go to thinkwhy.org, subscribe, and never miss a show.